Hello, we're Bonnie and Greg Dixon with Jerry Smith here, and we're going to be talking with Jonathan Kauffman about his book, Hippy
Hippy
Food.
Food.
So let's bring Jonathan on here, or do you have a few things you want to say?
Hello, Jonathan, and welcome to the show. We really appreciate you having you with us. And your book is one of my favorites on the topic of how do we get here in the natural food movement. And one thing I wanted to mention to people is that the book is great, but I loved the audible version of this book. My wife and I listened to it on a long trip home, and it was like, in fact, I visualized you as the narrator, which is common. They're professional narrators, but
sadly, I'm not a professional.
Yeah, that's hard job to do. When he mispronounced a couple of words, I thought, oh, okay, this is not Jonathan, but that's okay. The illusion was good. And your book, if we could see that book cover, for those of you who maybe have not seen it before, the book is called Hippy Foods, and the subtitle kind of gives you an idea of how convoluted the story is in a wonderful way. How back-to-landers, long hairs, and revolutionaries change the way we eat. Now, he's talking about we as a in mass culture, not just the fringe of society. So the stories are really relevant because this is the stuff we're eating. Like it mentions brown rice and so forth. That's not that unusual nowadays, and many people can get it at hundreds of stores where it was unavailable generally at local supermarkets, at local Safeway, and so forth. Before we have you go into detail, Jonathan, I just want to tell people we're going to focus on the chapter of the first chapter, which is fruits, seeds, and health nuts in Southern California. But the other chapters are wonderful, and I just wanted to let people know how great, how many aspects that you consider in this. The chapter 2 is brown rice and macrobiotic pioneers, brown bread and the pursuit of wholesomeness, tofu, the political dish, back to the landers and organic farming, vegetarians on the curry trail, food co-ops, social revolutionaries, and the birth of an industry. Now that one was very interesting about how the players changed places and did musical chairs and ended up to what we have today. But what prompted you to write this book, Jonathan? It must have been quite a journey.
In some ways, it was a bit of a culinary autobiography, in the sense that, when I was I'm 50 years old. I was born in 1971, and so when I was a restaurant critic back in the Bay Area in Seattle, I went and visited a restaurant that was a vegetarian place that had been there since 1975, and I took a couple of friends who were my own age, and we had this meal of nut loaf and steamed vegetables with lemon tahini sauce over brown rice, and these dishes that I realized I had this real sense of connection to. And all of us, we were sort of like, oh, this feels very homey. And it made me wonder, these foods were kind of going out of style, but the ingredients in them were everywhere. And it made me wonder, what was this cuisine that came about in the 1970s, and how did people start eating these foods? And how did my parents, who were in, liberal Mennonites in a small town in northern Indiana, how did they start eating this food? It wasn't just hippie food. It was kind of already spreading across the country. So I decided to, after a few years, I decided to really look at, just interview a bunch of people who had been making food in the 1960s and 70s and trace back some of these foods like whole wheat bread and brown rice and things like macrobiotics. And what I quickly realized was that this story was so much bigger, and it dated so much farther back than the 1960s. And case in point was I had no idea how Southern California had really become this sort of epicenter for what became the health food movement in the United States, and how those roots went back to the 19th century, but also how things like alfalfa sprouts and carob and wheat germ really were all coming out of, or they were popularized by a group of people and a sort of a movement that was based in Southern California in the 1920s through the 1950s.
Well, cool. Well, you have to be careful treading there, Jonathan, because I was born and raised in Southern California, but I already agree there are a bunch of nuts there, and that's what makes it an interesting place to live.
Well, what was so much fun about this book was that, I mean, I knew that it was going to be a lot of fun to interview a bunch of old hippies, because I knew the stories were going to be good. And half of the stories that, I got to hear from people I couldn't even print in the book because I couldn't get corroboration for some of the wilder tales. But,
yeah.
Going back even further, there were so many fascinating, eccentric, interesting people involved in this movement, going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century.
Well, now, obviously there's different answers to this, but can you characterize different motivations behind the people who were that you could tell us about? And like I said, they must vary, but some of them, in reading your book, they were self-described as crusades and so forth. I mean, obviously some people want to make money, but some people want to make converts. And was it a bit of both, or some more than others?
I think it really was. I mean, there's definitely always been, or at least since the 19th century, there's been a tie between spiritual pursuits and health and food, and at least in America. And, so you look at a group like the Seventh-day Adventists who've been vegetarians since the 1840s, and there's a real close link between health, wellness, diet, and religion. And then, Southern California also attracted a lot of spiritual seekers and a lot of folks practicing Indian mystic traditions. And there was dietary component to that. But it really, what I saw emerge in the 1920s in Southern California, part of the reason that Southern California was a nexus for this kind of thinking around health and diet was twofold. And one was that Southern California was a health destination that started really with the railroad when it connected southern LA to the East Coast. And so you had this perennially warm climate, access to lots of fresh fruits and vegetables. California was becoming the Garden State. And so you had a lot of health seekers, tuberculosis seekers who started settling in the area in the late 1900s. And then in the 1920s, 1910s, 1920s, Hollywood and the film industry settled in Southern California. And then there was this focus on beauty. And so health wasn't just about, getting ill, recovering from illness. It was really about how you can look, your optimum, so that there's this sort of fertile mix of spiritual seekers, health seekers, and the beautiful people who settled in Southern California.
And the beautiful people tended to have maybe a higher concentration of disposable income, which didn't hurt some of these early advocates, I'm sure, which is nothing new. It's still going on. Well, that's interesting. Well, maybe we can focus on some characters of that era. Can you tell me a little bit about, for people who don't know anything about Paul Bragg, who is well known from the Bragg Company's products, is still selling now, but what was he about?
So Paul Bragg was, as I understand, he was a disciple of Bernard McFadden. And Bernard McFadden was really, he was a bodybuilder and a vegetarian advocate who published a bunch of magazines, fitness magazines, and true crime magazines. And he was based in New York. And he was really the first proponent of exercise in the United States. And so Paul Bragg had worked with Bernard McFadden in New York, and then came out to LA in the 1920s and started leading hiking groups and running a dietary center. And he kind of brought a lot of those ideas that were circulating around the health food community in the East Coast to Southern California. And so he embarked on he published cookbooks, but he also conducted these nutritional crusades up and down the West Coast, and also as far as the Midwest, where he would give lectures about, eating healthfully, exercising. He would flex his arms a lot. He and sort of adapting certain foods, having a more vegetarian or vegetable friendly diet, eating more what we now know as fiber, fasting occasionally. Some of those central practices for the around health food that he popularized to the much broader community.
And so I was reading in your book that maybe one of the better known names off of a second or third generation of that was Jack LaLanne.
Mm-hmm.
And
so, yeah, Jack LaLanne, who I think a lot of us now knew from, either his 1950s fitness daytime television fitness shows where he would dress in a leotard and like he sort of show folks how to what was it called, gymnastics. But also he had juicers as well and would sell some sort of food related products. But he grew up in Oakland, California, and was kind of he said that his interest in fitness and diet arose from seeing a Paul Bragg crusade.
So that went right to television, and I remember sitting when as a youngster, put my potato chips down and tried to listen to what he was saying, because he was on like regularly as a local show. So, and very peppy.
Yeah.
But to his credit, I met him at one of the Expo West shows at Anaheim Stadium. He was sitting in a chair. He had some walking problems at that point, he did a seated exercise program he was promoting at the show, which for those of you who don't know, these are tremendously large shows. He was very sharp, very alert, and he was in his 80s. So that was
and a lot of his dietary, when you look at some of his old cookbooks, a lot of the dietary information seems very on par with what you'd see today in terms of fresh fruits and vegetables, lean meats, things like that.
So some of the disciples then of these different forebears mellowed a bit, obviously. Now, speaking of the opposite of mellowing, though, in your book, I remember a character, I'll call him that because he was and he knew it, a man named Gypsy Boots. So tell us, that was a really interesting, evolving story of how he got started, and then he was like a poster child for health, fitness, and craziness.
So I started looking at the story of Gypsy Boots for two reasons, and one was that I sort of fell in love with him and his story through his books, and he's, there are little snippets of videos that you can find online, but also because I was looking for people who were a link between this health food movement and the counterculture of the 1960s, and how those ideas and some of the foods that you'd find in these tiny little health food stores around the country were like making their way into counterculture baby boomer circles. And so Gypsy Boots, he was born in San Francisco to a working class family, and he decided, his mother was a vegetarian, but he decided to kind of drop out. He was one of the first dropouts. The sort of the he was like a beat before the beats. He was a hippie before the hippies. He moved into the desert and went up and down California, sort of picking vegetables and fruits with the seasons. And he grew his hair long, and he had a beard, and he would live in the canyons when he wasn't sort of meeting up with these fellow like-minded folks who ended up calling themselves the Nature Boys. And the Nature Boys were sort of modeled after late 19th century German Lebensreform of characters who believed in raw food and fasting and exercise. And so they would show up on playing bongos on Muscle Beach in LA.
Mm-hmm.
He was just sort of this ambient character, and then he opened up a restaurant called the Health Hut for 2 years, where they served, sprout sandwiches and soybean casseroles. But he really kind of came to fame after the restaurant folded, probably in the very beginning of the 1960s, when Steve Allen, who had a very, very popular nightly show, he had a kook booker who was always looking for people to bring onto the show to entertain Steve and the guests, and he encountered Gypsy somewhere and said, oh, you need to come on the show. And so Gypsy Boots, shows up on Steve Allen's show and is like making him a smoothie and reciting poetry, and he's so charismatic, and Steve Allen fell in love with him, and he kind of became a regular presence on the show. And so he, lots of people started drinking fresh juices and smoothies after he came on and would espouse his message of health and goodwill.
Yes, and I've seen some YouTube footage of him when he was 76, and he was just a firecracker. I'm getting up there myself, and I thought, how come I don't have that much energy? So he was a living testimonial. But don't you think, though, tell us there maybe a juxtaposition from this hippie prototype, okay? That there were also, and we're focusing on Southern California, and so these stories are true of other places and maybe for other reasons in the East and so forth. But wasn't there quite an established, say by the late 50s, early 60s, traditional health food store in Southern California? And how do they mix? How do these things mix?
There were a number of them, but there were also little health food stores that were sold sort of the same range of products, that ranged from whole grain flours to things like Altadena milk or Hain, some of the Hain products that showed up in little cities around the country, and so they were the first place that counterculture kids, when they started looking for alternative diet, alternative ways to live, and some of these specialty products they were hearing and reading about, they would go to these stores and sort of picked up not just some of the products like Bragg's liquid amino acids or wheat germ, but some of the ideas that were embedded in them.
Mm-hmm. How more fundamental can you get if you feel that there's corruption in your food? I mean, that's going to be seeds of doubt to don't trust anybody over 30 years and so forth. Mm-hmm. And the other more philosophical storm clouds in the 60s. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think what was fascinating for me to look at the health food scene from for the Southern California health food scene, and was that it was really focused on the idea of vitality, and that came from Germany and the Lebensreform movement, but also and sort of figures like Arnold Ehret, Otto Karke, who moved from Europe to Southern California and were selling health foods. But there's this idea that you don't want devitalized food. You want to eat food at its most vital. And so you want to have juice, that it's like freshly squeezed juice. You don't want to have devitalized mineral salts. You want to have things like spike, which are, or seaweed, or liquid amino acids. You want to have, if you're having eggs, you want to have fertilized eggs because they're at their most vital. So this sort of ideas that shape these products that I found that I would buy at natural food stores 50 years later were all kind of there.
Now, I recall in your book that what perhaps in my observation, because I was raised by, my grandmother was a health foodist, but she was a big gardener, and in contrast, fresh foods, even in Southern California, some of the, shall we say, some of the older traditional health food stores, they had maybe had more supplements than they did have foods. Okay. Yeah. So it wasn't, I believe, wasn't Gypsy involved in some of that transition to like what we would now call organic foods, but basically non-pesticide, naturally grown? Wasn't he involved in some of that crossover?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how big of a proponent he was of organics, because that idea was like just coming into play. And so, the organic movement really began in Britain in the 1930s, but it wasn't. It came over to the United States in the early 1940s through J.I. Rodale, who was a publisher who published Prevention
course.
magazine and
Right.
Organic Gardening and Farming. And those two magazines were really focused on the idea that the soil that has the most organic matter is going to produce the best crops for both the environment and for humans, and that we should be eating foods that are naturally rich in vitamins and other nutrients. And so Gypsy was actually what we would probably call like, a fruit scout. He was like a produce scout, I think.
Okay.
Because he'd spent so long in the picking
it.
fruit, he had apparently impeccable taste and had these amazing sources for both fresh and dried fruits. And so he would kind of deal directly, like he would come to Hollywood salons, and you would buy fresh fruits from him, or he'd go to restaurants, or he'd go to the markets and sell all these products. So everybody who was in that world kind of knew him and probably bought from him when they could.
In fact, Bonnie had told us that he would visit their store back when she was new in the natural food store, and so he was inspirational and practical at the same time in facilitating that. Sounds like.
My other favorite Gypsy Boots, sort of connection to today is that he may have invented the modern energy bar. Not sure about that, but he had a Boots bar, and he worked with a confectioner who made it out of dried fruits and nuts, and it was sold all over Southern California, and it was pretty much like what Kind bars are today.
Oh, so. Yeah, mostly pressed, right? Because it had fruit in it that didn't need to do. Yeah. Before I forget, I don't recall because I've got used to his comment, but in your book you tell us where his name kind of evolved from his given name. Do you recall it? I didn't.
Yeah, his given name was Robert Bootson.
There we go.
And he eventually was called Boots.
Not apparently a legal name change, but better than that, a famous name change. Well, and his gypsy activity was because he traveled so much. One thing I remember in your book that the nature boys would live sometimes in caves, which I thought was really what we would call primitive backpacking. But what an interesting influence he I don't know if do you think he was cognizant of the impact he had on at least California culture?
I think he was aware of the attention and the attention he got from the counterculture kids, because later in life he would hang out in Griffith Park in LA, which was really the sort of the big hangout where all of the counterculture kids hung out. And he recorded a song with his group, the Gypsy Boots and the Hairy Hoots. We're going to a love-in. So,
okay.
And he was invited to perform at the Newport Folk Festival, or one of the major festivals. So hippie kids and he sort of knew there was an instinctive connection.
So besides political action, then, really he was instrumental, and others no doubt like him, to infuse food culture into that equation. We did an interview with Robert Tepper, who was an early member of The Farm.
I know Robert, or I talked to Robert.
Yes, and that's very similar, because they started off at a community college, and a whole group of them went with the whose name escapes me, the leader.
Gaskin.
Very good. Okay. And so these are overlapping stories, and where else but California would you find this? But it's spread all over the country, really, and that's the rest of your chapter show. It wasn't just a California phenomenon, that these ideas spread and were enlarged upon and had different flavors, right? In fact, is there other chapters in your book that might show an example of what I'm mentioning here about how they interpreted some of this and expanded on it?
Interpreted sort of health.
Let's just jump to what, in my mind, which is hard to follow, the co-ops, because really what we're talking, what these retail stores became, or what was mostly present now, a cooperative or a private version of a cooperative where there's lots of fresh foods, pure foods, fresh foods, and a bountiful supply, not just a few things on that shelf has the food.
Yeah.
So,
So
go ahead.
yeah, so a lot of the co-ops began as buying clubs, and a lot of the buying clubs really began as, when hippie kids they were shopping at these little health food stores, and they maybe weren't finding all of the unprocessed foods that they wanted, or the sources for organic vegetables that they wanted. But they also wanted to take control not just of the food they were eating and putting in their bodies, but the means of production and the way of distributing it. So these food buying clubs would gather together. They'd buy big bags of oats, or big bags of, big jars of peanut butter and cheese, to split up among communes or families. And a lot of those evolved into these tiny little co-ops that were both selling this food, but also trying to create an anti-capitalist network that was very people-centered and driven by volunteer labor, where they were going to build a kind of an economics, a supply chain outside of the commodity supply chain.
A alternative sourcing,
Yeah.
skipping the different profit layers that made natural food more expensive than it needed to be. And I know in reading those, you find a lot of cross-fertilizing in farms, because if you farm these, you got to have some place that sells them. There are people going to know what it is and give you a fair price for them, because they're more labor intensive and less productive per pound compared to ordinary conventional. So is that what you think drove a lot of the organic farmers to convert to being organic farmers and to feeding those co-ops?
I think having a market for it really helps. Yeah, I mean, that was also the rebirth of the farmers markets came out of that time as well. But the co-ops, co-ops and restaurants, sort of hip restaurants, were where they could sell this product. I mean, people didn't really value, the mainstream America didn't really value produce, grown without pesticides or fertilizers, but certainly the counterculture kids did, and people and the co-ops did.
Of course, until Joni Mitchell's song, right? But birds give me worms in my apples, etc. Well, things are definitely changing, very dynamic times, and we'd love for you to come back again and tell us more details about this fascinating journey that you've chronicled, and we really appreciate you telling us in person and not just in your book. But we want to make sure that you'll see some links here about how you can get your own copy of the book. And again, I highly recommend the Audible the download, the narrative part of the book, because it really it's like you're talking to a experienced uncle there when you listen to it. At least that was my experience. So you could get a copy of Hippy Food, and then you'll better understand how we got from there to here, because that is our theme here. So thank you so much again, Jonathan. Fascinating stories, and we hope to hear some more from you soon.
All right. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome.